and he heads up the African American Diaspora Network. The questions that you had submitted earlier have all been compiled, and we're going to be asking those questions. So please stay in your seat. Christian, it's all yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to take a moment, if you would, in helping me give a round of applause for the people that put this event together, the wonderful volunteers that made this event a reality. The space is absolutely phenomenal. I'd like to also pay homage to Frederick Douglass, who spoke in this room himself once before. And his relationship, Frederick Douglass's relationship to Daniel O'Connell. And it is in spirit of, right? Go ahead, thank you. And it is in that spirit of unity that we come here today, and of course, we begin this panel. You've seen each of these panelists throughout the day. I'm with an esteemed group of people. We're excited to close out this summit with some interesting questions that were posed from you, the audience. Many of you dropped some notes, some little questions, little nuggets in the boxes in the back. So rather than, we had prepared questions, but we audibled and we said, why not take this opportunity to really take some insight and some questions from the people, directly from the people, and offer it up to our panelists here. So we're excited to do so. So round of applause for our panelists as we close out. So thank you, and this question I'm going to pose is for all three of you. Mary Lou, I'll begin with you. What can the U.S. do, and how can the U.S. facilitate Irish unity and securing Irish unity?
Okay, Christian, so thank you for that question. And I suppose that's in the end what it all boils down to, isn't it? Because I think we're all agreed that we are in a moment of change. We're at a very particular inflection point in Irish history, in the Irish journey, and all of us want to help in a constructive and an inclusive way. The United States will be absolutely central to this journey over the next decade. Just as in Easter 1916, when the proclamation was read, there you were, acknowledged in that foundational document, our gallant sons and daughters in America. Because we are an emigrant nation by tradition, we rely hugely on our international family, and that's what you are. I don't like the term diaspora, Christian, because I think it sounds like a medical procedure. So I rather prefer global family. It appeals more to my sensibility.
That's right.
So item number one is keep this issue on the agenda. So I heard a lot of people talk earlier and say, okay, so we've had this awful trauma collectively. We've had conflict. We've endured and inflicted pain. We get to peace. And there is a danger, of course, then people say, well, sure, that's done. Ireland's done. You know, we sorted that out. So I think the core thing that we need to do is rally the United States to the reunification agenda in the same way that the United States and activists rallied so effectively to the causes of justice and peace. So it's a reset moment. We're hitting a reset button here. It's part of the same continuum, the same journey, but it's got a different focus now, sustaining our peace, making the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement work, but now we start the next leg of the journey. And I think we need to build a real sense of purpose and enthusiasm in that. So there'll be a presidential election in the autumn. Irish reunification. Why would that question not be a question for whoever it is occupies the White House next time? I think it should be. And then, in a way, this is a hall full of very experienced activists in some cases, so I don't have to tell you how to go about your business, but let me say this, and I will finish on this point. Don't anybody imagine that simply because we have a provision in the Good Friday Agreement that the British will simply honour that and say, fair enough, let's have our referendum. That's not going to happen, in my opinion. In my opinion, we will have to have a concerted international pressure and narrative and constructive demand for the British to honour the spirit and the letter of the Good Friday Agreement, and to recognise that it is the Irish people and the Irish people alone, without interference or coercion, who finally will make this call in referendums at the ballot box. So that's going to be a big, big campaign for us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary Lou. I appreciate that. And Professor Yu, what can the U.S. do to secure Irish unity?
So the characteristic response of the US to any national question inside any existing sovereign state is to say it's for that sovereign state to decide matters. We're neutral. The United States State Department has sometimes been described as an organization which exists to protect the territorial integrity of every state in the world, no matter how unjustified. So that's the background against which one has to appraise future US policy. I think Irish advocates of unification have a head start because of the text of the Good Friday Agreement and because it's an international treaty. That obliges the UK government, under certain circumstances, to hold a referendum. I absolutely agree with Mary Lou McDonald's implied point about the dangers of perfidious Albion. Albion is regularly known to break international treaties or to try to break international treaties. What we have experienced, both under the Trump administration and under the Biden administration, is a successful demonstration of how Irish America, as well as organized Ireland, can use our collective power to get America to insist that the UK keeps to its international pledges. And I think that's the general direction in which our activism and or diplomacy should be geared. I would emphasize two things. There's two features of the Good Friday Agreement that have not been incorporated into UK domestic law. If we had had one of them during the Brexit period, then I think things might have gone differently. Under the Good Friday Agreement, there is an obligation on the incumbent sovereign government over Northern Ireland to exercise rigorous impartiality between the national traditions on the island of Ireland. That's an international law obligation, but it's not incorporated into domestic UK law. That means, in effect, the UK doesn't really have to abide by it unless it's called out, in which case it's a mere embarrassment. So I would argue that activists on the island of Ireland, people in Great Britain and people here, should argue for the full implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, and that would require the insertion of a rigorous impartiality requirement into UK domestic law. That would strengthen the argument for a referendum taking place when it's required. The second change that I should like to see is to echo partly what Mary Lou said just a few moments ago. Under the Good Friday Agreement, there is a requirement that the exercise of Irish self-determination, north and south, should occur without external impediment. Without external impediment. So who is the external impedimentor? Well, historically, we know who the external impedimentor is. And the question then becomes, how do you make that operational? How do you ensure that when Ireland votes north and south, that the referendum is fair, the referendum is one public space in which there can be good arguments back and forth on Irish unification? That requires, in my view, the UK to be locked in so that its civil servants are required to act in such a way that there is no interference from the great British state in the running of the referendum. I don't mind about political parties. Political parties can express their preferences on anything, but what is required is that the behaviour of the UK state and its officials be rigorously impartial. Now, I've been long-winded about this, but these are the things that I would want American diplomats and Irish-American activists to focus on, to protect the process that we won in 1998 and ensure its effective implementation. I could say more, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor Niall. Please weigh in. What can the U.S. do to secure Irish unity?
Well, do what we're doing. The energy that we have all experienced in this room is something that I derive a great sense of renewal from as I go home to Ireland to recommit to the next phase of our own activism in terms of what our organisation, Ireland's Future, is going to do. So be present. I spoke earlier about change doesn't happen by itself, and people need to make change. And the admiration and experience of Irish American activism that assisted the delivery of the Good Friday Agreement was by change makers, was by history makers. And I spoke about the exceptional people that I have met in my life in the last number of years. General Jim Cullen, whom I am honoured to have participated in an internship named in his honour. We take a student every year, recommended to us by the Brehon Law Society in our law practice. And that's through initiatives like that, we get to re-engage younger activists and educated, articulate, diligent younger people. And we need all of you to assist us in creating history. And I know that Professor John Feerick from Fordham University is in the room, and he is a man who has created constitutional law history and is someone from whom I take a great degree of inspiration. He was the author of the 25th Amendment to the US Constitution. But that demonstrates that people can make a difference in terms of the constitutional makeup of a country. And we would not be where we are in our mature, peaceful democracy had it not been for the activism and energy of you. And we need it again as we move into the next 5 or 6 years, are perhaps the most critical in the history of our island. We are going to need the renewed energy and activism of all of you to ensure that your political representatives are attuned to the facts. As I say, our organisation likes to, or aims to, infuse social discourse with empirical evidence. Take that evidence, take all of the literature, and educate your own legislators, and be the influence that will create the change on our island.
Professor, earlier when you were speaking, you mentioned a dynamic that you felt was not effectively evaluated, right? Which was the undecided, right? Those individuals who are undecided or are not necessarily of Irish descent. So specifically, what are the key issues for those who are undecided and those who identify as British? What's important to them, and how can they facilitate this effort as well?
Right. It's a very good question. We've begun to explore this in ARINS, Analysing and Researching Ireland North and South. The unknowns who respond that they don't know on what to question can indeed include some whom you've identified who are what we characteristically call the new Irish, those who weren't born on the island. But generally speaking, they tend to have an answer. They tend to line up. Historically, immigrants, believe it or not, identify with the government that controls the country when they arrive. Interestingly, His Majesty's government and the behaviour of unionist incumbents has not had that impact in Northern Ireland. Some migrants favour Irish nationalist parties and some favour unionists. Typically, those migrants would be expected to go for preserving the union. That's not the case. And one of the reasons it's not the case, I think, is that Irish nationalism has been successfully, in its modern incarnations, not hostile to immigrants and not ethnically exclusivist. And that has not always been true, to put it mildly, of loyalism and unionism. And that has to remain the pattern of Irish nationalist behaviour if it doesn't want to lose the new Irish who exist both in the north and in the south. That's one, that's a partial segue. The don't knows are mostly cultural Catholics, but they also include cultural Protestants. Among the cultural Catholics who don't know, they're worried about their economic futures. They're particularly worried about the idea of Irish unification without a plan. They want to know what the health service arrangements will be like. They want to know what the educational arrangements will be like. They're also less likely to know things, which implies that they're available for educational campaigns. And I think one of the things we can tell with some degree of confidence is that the northern don't know as much about the Republic of Ireland as you would want them to be informed voters in a referendum. The don't knows in the south have some very interesting characteristics. They have exactly the same uncertainties and exactly the same rigidities of those who favour unification. So they don't like the Commonwealth, they don't like changing the flag, they don't like changing the anthem. They like the traditional symbols of the Irish state. That's interesting. Doesn't mean that there's no change possible among this category of people. I think we have evidence this year that they can be flexible in some circumstances. But it does mean that those who favour unification in the south need to target keeping the base. And if they keep the base, that's sufficient to win the south. The much more difficult task is winning the north and having strategic appraisals of the don't knows, outreach, improved public education, improved public knowledge. And here I'll conclude with one final tension, which is a particular problem for Mary Lou's party, because it's one of the very few all-island parties. Sinn Féin is the leading party of the opposition in the Republic. So, as the leading party of the opposition, it does its job. It criticises the Republic of Ireland, its current government, its current administration. And that's what oppositions should do. But that is heard in the north, including by Sinn Féin voters in the north. So they ask themselves, if they hear all this criticism of the south, why should we unify with this badly governed entity, with this problematic entity, this entity where public services are not as good as they are, where housing is a mess? That's a tension. If you're an all-island party and you want unity, the south has to be presented partly in an extremely positive light. Yes, it has flaws, but I would emphasize more the positive features of the south if you're going to sway uncertain opinion in the north. Now that's a tension for any all-island party. Now one way to resolve it, of course, is to focus on the joint benefits of unification. But it does mean that there's a particular difficulty for you. Every time you criticize the government in the south, that is heard in the north as a criticism of the entire project of unification, even if that's not a reasonable or fair judgment. So that's a difficulty for the period ahead. It becomes easier, of course, if Sinn Féin's in government, because then they have to defend the government of Ireland, right? So that's, you're out. That's how you solve my conundrum.
Mary Lou, how do you offer up the South's value to the?
As I was listening to Brendan, I was thinking, well, the obvious solution is that we're in government. I mean, come on. So, so I'm glad you offered that up. just to say this, and the data is fascinating, and the work that's being done by Brendan and others is so valuable. But let me just enter this caveat, and I think it's an important one. All of this data is being gathered, these questions are being posed in a political environment that has not seen, as of yet, the Dublin government saying, now we're going to talk. Now we're going to plan, now we're going to prepare. And some people might say, well, you know, that's only a nuance. It's not. In the world of political activism, and as somebody whose job is, my job is about people, connecting with people, hearing people, trying to inform and influence and mobilize people, it is a world of difference when the administration says out loud, change is happening, we need to manage the change, we will manage it democratically and peacefully, we will manage it in an inclusive way, we want to hear from everyone. Here is the democratic space in which this will happen. That to me is a profound game changer, because then all of a sudden people say, oh, okay, what's this? It's like campaigning for an election. And of course you have to do a lot of the donkey work and the door knocking early, or else you're just not going to get around and talk to enough people. But does anyone know that part of the campaign where you're knocking, you're saying, yeah, well, people are chatting to me, but they don't even realise there's an election on yet. Very hard to enthuse people into kind of a non-process. So the preparation bit is important. Can I just add one thing as well? Because I was listening carefully to Brendan's fireside chat, and there was only one point that I have a slightly different perspective on when you said, don't expect unionism to participate in their own demise. So they're not going to talk about it, they're not going to prepare. And in one way, that's a rational position. Of course, if you are a unionist, you are not going to plot and plan, you know, with Fenians who are trying to end the union. On one level, that makes sense. However, I don't think that's the full story, actually. And I think we need to get to a place where the public discourse says this. Each of us has our first preference. Mine is clearly for reunification. That's my preference today. I want Ireland united now, this minute, if I could make it happen. But since that's not happening, I have to, and we as Republicans, have to be in the conversation about power sharing, about that jurisdictional, because our border is a contested border still. But we don't get to opt out and say, no, get lost, we're not talking. And I think in the same way, but gently, and I'm not saying this to admonish unionism, unionism needs to know that they are a necessary part of this conversation. Because you see, whatever happens, we live together. You see, whatever happens, none of us are going anywhere, bar if we come here for a while and then you have people like me trying to lure you back, you know. So, fine. Another thought, Christian. When Brexit happened, do you remember it was calamitous? We said, "Holy God, what are the Brits at now?" Right? So we all knew we're going to have to talk about this and organise it. And at the time, Enda Kenny was Taoiseach, so he was convening a forum. But initially, the forum was just to be of the South, 26 counties, and we managed, in fairness to him, to change his mind on that, and he convened an All-Ireland forum. And the naysayers said, "Sure, what are you at? Unionism won't come. They're not going to come." And okay, the DUP didn't come. That's no great surprise. The UUP didn't come. Alliance did, but unionists came. They were hauliers, they were farmers, they were business people. They came and they really engaged in that conversation. So I don't think, and I hope I'm not over-egging the point here, but I think it's an important one. I would not concede that unionism that we shouldn't have an expectation. I have an expectation that unionists are part of the conversation. When I go and talk in universities, in the likes of Queen's or elsewhere, you do the talk, and at the end you can guaranteed that there'll be one or two or three or five hanging back, you know, kind of looking at the wall, and then they'll come up and they'll say, "Oh, how are you?" And the conversation goes something like "I'm not one of you," or you know, I wouldn't be your way, or straight up, I'm a Protestant. I'm a Dubliner. I don't care if you're a Protestant, a Catholic, a Muslim, a Jew. It's irrelevant to me. But anyway, and they will say, I'm not really sure what my politics is yet, but in some cases, I isbralam anchanga gaelga. You know, I love Irish and I want to speak it. Or this Brexit thing's nuts. Or I'm 19. I'm studying finance or law. I want the best life I can have. And you need to convince me what that is. So it's a much more fluid thing. And there was a time where unionism was a homogenous, all-conquering bloc. You know this, Niall, in the society into which you were born and grew up. That's not the case anymore. It's much more complex than that. So we need to give a little bit of respect to the unionist community, that it's not just one thing. It's much more graded. And so I would be challenging them to say, sorry, you are us, we are you. You don't get to walk away from the table. And I think we need to, you know, diplomatically, kindly, with kindness, just with decency and kindness, say, we want you here. And I will definitely finish on this point, and I do not mean to sound sexist, but if I do, that's just the way it is. I think women are going to have a really important role, in particular, in that type of collaborative outreach and so on. Because see, at the end of the day, if you are somebody's ma, and I know they're dads and men as well, but I'm speaking as a woman and a mother, I want what I want for my kids, and I want that for everybody else's children and grandchildren. And I think we as mothers and women can be powerful, powerful agents of change across all communities and cultures.
Thank you. Wow. Yeah, go ahead. I see you want to weigh in, Professor. Go ahead, please.
So,
Just briefly, yeah.
may I agree and clarify? You're absolutely right that once the Irish government gets serious preparation underway, a Ministry of Unification, a standing constitutional forum, and so on, and credibly looks like it's preparing for unification, that is going to modify people's attention and their interest. And at that juncture, we're going to have Irish government websites that answer the simple question that was posed earlier in the afternoon. Somebody expressed concern, I think it was Glenn Bradley, about his pension. Let me assure Glenn about his pension. It's a pension from His Majesty's government. That is binding under UK law to him wherever he chooses to retire, whether it be in Tierra del Fuego or whether it be in South Dublin. He's automatically entitled to that pension. The only important question is which bank account does he have that deposited in every 13 weeks. I'm speaking with intimate knowledge here because I will get my UK pension even though I'm resident in the United States for the time I spent there. That has to be on an Irish government website. Answers to all prospective fears, both the groundless fears, which I think state pensions are a groundless fear, and other kinds of fear. That they all have to be carefully answered. And we haven't got anything like that preparation. And that will be very important for the don't knows. One final clarification. Unionists, when I said they would not engage, I meant their political parties and their leadership.
Yes,
I did not mean ordinary citizens who often express interest in the way that you mention. And it's absolutely vital that Irish nationalists of all kinds must encourage unionists to participate in every possible forum, if only to say, you had your opportunity, we invited you all the time, I'm sorry you didn't come along, but we did try. We have to be absolutely pure and white in terms of our participatory goals and efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Neil, I think you're uniquely positioned to answer this question, and it can be very difficult to project, right? But in your mind, in your view, what is a reasonable timetable for a referendum?
Well, again, I'm going to lean back into our 2030 document. We genuinely, sincerely believe 2030 is a reasonable time frame to allow the sufficient legislative, governmental policy work to be set down. And
Can you define the characteristics?
yeah, and I think we might benefit from some detail. So if you permit me to just reflect on what our respectful chronology uphold. So 2025 is going to be a year of elections in both jurisdictions, and there will be new governments formed, most certainly in the Republic of Ireland, and that permits the potential establishment of fresh institutions. We have respectfully suggested that there should be, as Brendan quite correctly touches upon, a dedicated Ministry of Government with a minister and the full resource of a civil service to the preparation for reunification. As to how that might manifest itself, that could be an expansion of the current Shared Island initiative. There is also the opportunity to convene a joint committee of the Oireachtas. As the latter part of 2025 unfolds, we feel in March perhaps of 2025 that there could or should be preparatory planning tabled at a British-Irish intergovernmental conference with government intentions, the 5-year mandate, being very explicit as to what that government intends to discharge. That will also require engagement with the European Union, with the United Nations and with the Council of Europe, because there will be an international governmental investment in the creation of a new state. We feel that Irish government should also publish a green paper, a programme of government. There will also require debates where we feel civic society has an important role to play. There does need to be civic discourse, proper, meaningful, deliberative engagement, so people directly have an opportunity to engage in that conversation. There could be thematic formats of different civic assemblies, including but not limited to health. We talked about this earlier: education, the economy, constitutional reform, infrastructure. We've just seen the Irish government invest 600 million upgrading the A5 road, which will take us to Derry and Donegal. Social protection, justice. I have a personal interest in policing. There's a huge amount of work that needs done in policing, the administration of justice. I've contemplated how changes that will require to be made there. Will there be a Court of Appeal which would sit in Belfast? Would there be changes to the different court jurisdictions in the Northern Circuit? There is a huge amount of work that requires to be considered and debated in so many different spheres, and that is the sovereign work of government. We think as we move into 2027 that reports then will be in a position to be published. The National Programme for a New and United Ireland as a programme for government will have been informed by the debates which will have taken place in 2026. We consider that at that time, and in our view, September to December, the latter part of 2027, both British and Irish governments can agree a new joint declaration. We know, for history informs us, that there was a joint Downing Street declaration which laid the pathway for the peace process, which ultimately delivered the Good Friday Agreement. And in our chronology, we feel that there is the requirement for there to be a joint declaration from both governments as to how they're going to timetable a date for referendum and what the parameters of that process might be. We've heard previous panels today discuss what would be the appropriate franchise. Just thinking, was this? Sorry. Who has a vote? What age do you have to be? What electoral register do you require to be on? There quite a bit of minutiae that, sorry, I think requires to be deliberated and set explicit. Professor O'Leary is quite right. There requires to be a website which will have the answers for people to interrogate, for people to understand exactly what the clear, informed position is. And we see 2029 effectively being a year of the campaign, and the preparatory work can and should be done beforehand. And this is again where we feel the strong independent voice of the American government can bring responsible pressure to bear on a British government, on a British Secretary of State, to specify the criteria upon which he will consider his obligations under Schedule 1 of the Northern Ireland Act. The Northern Ireland Act is the legislative expression of the Good Friday Agreement. It is the law, and Schedule 1 of the Northern Ireland Act 1988 defines the legal responsibility which is placed. He is going to assess when discharging his legal obligations in that regard. And then 2030, we feel at the conclusion of the mandate of the next Irish government that is an appropriate time, that the preparatory work has been undertaken, done, society understands exactly what the issues are, and then we have a vote. We have an expression of democracy. I've lived my entire life in a jurisdiction to which I have absolutely no affinity, but I have lived my entire life and raised children in that society on the principle of consent. So let's test the principle of consent, and that's what democracy is. So 2030.
Thank you, sir. Ladies, and this conversation's been rich. Bunch of different nuggets in it. I don't know about you, but I'm fired up. I'm ready to go. Right? Right? Yeah. So, in closing, I want to thank our panelists once again for your kindness, your curiosity, your intellectual and political prowess and thoughts on these questions. I think it's going to be very instrumental as we begin to carve out, but certainly the broader world begins to carve out a path forward with unifying Ireland. So thank you all once again for participating. Thank you for your time. Yeah, and this is the Unity Summit.